Hello everyone, welcome to Think for Yourself. This is an introduction to critical thinking. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in these videos we're taking a look at some of the basic rules of critical thinking. If you want to follow along with us, this is the book we're using, A Workbook for Arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. Okay everyone, welcome back. I hope you guys are doing well. Let me zoom ahead here to where we're at. Just a quick reminder, last time we just looked at the first rule, which is basically identify premises and conclusions. In that video, we also talked a lot about what critical thinking means in a number of different ways. What we're going to be doing over the course of this semester is slowly building on by using these sort of short rules for thinking. The idea here is that if you're able to actually do these rules, you should end up as a pretty rigorous thinker. In this video, we're taking a look at rule number 2, developing your ideas in a natural order. This is one that's interesting because we're all familiar with reading a book, hearing another person argue, and they've got lots of different ideas, and none of them seem to quite line up. And this is basically the idea that when we construct arguments, remember an argument here is when you have premises, and those premises support a conclusion, right? Is that those premises need to develop and be related in a way that actually makes sense. So let's sort of jump here now to the next scene. Okay, so when we make an argument, again, we have premises and we have a conclusion. Now the premises support the conclusion, but just because the premises occur or necessary for the conclusion, and in logic we typically write the premises first and then the conclusion, this does not mean that you can't state the conclusion first. Sometimes, especially in a shorter argument, it makes more sense to actually just state what the conclusion is and then give the reasons, right? You could say, for instance, I'm going to be a better student this year because last year I had lots of trouble being a good student and my grades suffered, right? In that case, I gave the conclusion first and then the premises second. Sometimes it makes more sense to give the premises first and then give the conclusion, right? Someone could conversely argue, I didn't do well last semester and my grades suffered, therefore I need to do a better job of being a good student, right? In that case, we have the conclusion in the end. Now, how you actually want to write your arguments depends on you, and it depends on your writing style. What you want to do is you want to, quote, develop an argument in an order that unfolds your line of reasoning most clearly for the reader or for the other person that's listening. I think the key term here is clarity, right? The key here, I've seen this in a lot of, for instance, student papers that students write for my philosophy classes, is that they'll write papers where there's lots of interesting ideas, but they don't clearly align. They don't clearly develop in an order that's comprehensible and easy for me to understand as their reader. And some of that's because a lot of times when people make arguments, they're not exactly sure what their reasons are until they give them. So to be a good thinker here, you need to develop your arguments in an order that makes sense. Okay? Now, this means that each passage, each statement in your argument that you make needs to somehow prepare the way for the next statement. I'm calling this a link of inference, right? Inference is the basic idea in logic, in logic that when you make one claim, a claim or a premise here can be related to a set, you can infer something from that claim. So for instance, imagine if I said, I'm a teacher. If I say I'm a teacher, you can infer from that I do teacher-like things, right? So for instance, if I say I'm a teacher and you say, oh, does that mean that you give tests? Yes. Does that mean that all teachers give tests? No, right? But you can infer something based upon how well we understand that thing and how natural we would make an inferential link. So one of the things that's helpful is don't be afraid to rearrange your argument to make it stronger and more persuasive. In fact, sometimes the organization of our arguments that we're writing are stronger if we state the conclusion at the end. Other times they're stronger if we state it in the beginning. One of the things that's very helpful is to signal to your readers or to your listeners what your premises and your conclusions are by dropping these conclusion and premise indicator terms. We looked at those in Rule 1. A premise indicator, for instance, is a word like because. Whatever comes after because essentially tells you that that's a premise, or that's evidence for the thing that's being argued, the conclusion. There's also conclusion indicator terms like thus or therefore. They're quite helpful because they really help your reader understand things clearly. Sometimes when you're writing a paper or you're making an argument, it can seem sort of repetitive to use these indicator terms. And you should try to use different ones and keep it varied. But the use of indicator terms plays a very important role for signaling and telling your reader what the organization, the flow of your argument is. So that way, and so when you're writing these arguments, sometimes they just need to be rearranged. And in fact, that brings us to the exercise set that you're going to be taking a look at for Rule 1 in the text. And what you're going to, and again, if you don't have the textbook, you can easily do the same exercise by just going to a newspaper website and looking at the letters to the editor or the columnist pages or whatnot, and you'll find arguments there. Now, what is this exercise? To practice learning how the inferential link works among these different passages and different statements. What you're going to do is you're going to take a passage and you're going to number the statements in the passage. And then you're going to rearrange them into a more natural inferential order. Okay? And I'm going to do an example of this here in just a second. The second thing that the exercise set here, I believe it's exercise set 1.3, concerns how to analyze visual arguments. And visual arguments are different because this exercise set requires you to go to the publisher's free website, and you can click on some pictures that they give you. But when you take a look at these visual arguments, they're going to show you a picture, and then they're going to say, okay, what argument does this picture suggest? And they're going to ask you to come up with a natural progressive argument related to the picture. Okay, but the easiest way is just to start by looking at these arguments and then sort of rearrange them. So I've color-coded this. Ignore the color coding. Just take this as an example. Someone argues, some companies are creating genetically modified animals, such as salmon, provide for more meat for consumers. If genetically modified salmon escaped into the wild, they would compete with natural salmon for food. Natural salmon, though, have been honed by natural selection to survive in the wild, whereas genetically modified salmon are not designed to flourish in the wild. Thus, non-genetically modified salmon would outcompete genetically modified salmon. It looks like I have a problem here. Non-genetically modified salmon would outcompete genetically modified salmon. I'm sorry about that. This is bad. Let me look it up. Somehow I mistyped it. Right. It should say, thus non-genetically modified salmon would outcompete genetically modified salmon if genetically modified salmon escaped into the wild. So there's a little bit of a typo there. Okay. So the question is, how are we going to break down this argument? Well, the first thing you always do is look for that conclusion. And see, we have a premise indicator term, so I didn't highlight that. I left it black, but you can see it. So what follows here is the conclusion. I mistyped it. Again, that conclusion is, thus, non-genetically modified salmon would outcompete genetically modified salmon if genetically modified salmon escaped into the wild. So somehow that got mistyped. Okay, that's what the conclusion is. Now that we know the conclusion, we have to figure out what the premises are. And you can see I've labeled each of the premises, each of the statements with a different color. The question that we would have to do is rearrange them. The first thing we'll see here is that this first statement is actually not a premise in the argument. It's more like something like an introductory statement or a transition statement. And this is important. Not every statement that's made in a conversation or in a written piece or in an essay is necessarily a part of an argument. So you've got to be able to begin to differentiate arguments from non-arguments and transition statements accordingly. So the core here is to look at the conclusion. What's the conclusion talking about? It's talking about non-genetically modified salmon out-competing genetically modified salmon and escaping things escaping in the wild. right? And one of the ways you can trace that is by looking at the words, right? Notice that we have the term wild here, wild's up here, right? We have genetically modified salmon. We have right here non-genetically modified salmon, and then we have genetically modified salmon, right? In fact, if you put this argument into its natural order, what you would do is you'd just basically delete this first sentence and then label them actually in the same order it is, where this is premise 1, this is premise 2, premise 3, and then premise 4. Now, this is an easy example precisely because we want you to become accustomed to doing these. But as you complete the exercises and as you begin to look at how things are naturally arranged in terms of their inferential pattern, you're going to see that oftentimes our arguments are all mismatched and all over the place for good writing style reasons, but not always the clearest way. So learn to become accustomed with understanding fundamentally what relates to what. That is, develop your ideas in a natural order. Thank you for watching. Think for yourself. Take a look at our next video, Rule 3.